Alrighty, so I decided to record this episode a day late because I had my first psychiatrist appointment. I had my first psychiatrist appointment this afternoon, and I wanted to share what it was all about. So that's what this episode's going to be about. It was interesting. It was good. I'm really glad I did it. So what I'm going to talk about is what led up to the appointment, my expectations going in, how I felt beforehand, and then how the actual session went and what the next steps are. So if this is your first time listening to this podcast, even though we're only a few episodes in, I do have an episode that you might want to have a listen to first, which is episode 1, which is all about sort of getting a diagnosis. But I'm still going to go into a little bit about what led to the appointment because I didn't totally explain that in the first episode based on what I remembered. Okay, so essentially what led to the appointment was I've been wondering for quite a while now whether I have ADHD. And one of the big sort of question marks for me and sort of something that's played on my mind for quite a long time is like, I did quite well at school and then I did pretty well at university. But then in terms of my career, it's been like, I've had this career, that career, didn't really know what I wanted to do, floated around, haven't ever really had a long full-time job, haven't been very good with my finances. I still kind of feel like a teenager in a lot of ways. Like I just kind of didn't go to that next stage of life that everyone seems to go to. And so, that was part of it, sort of being like, what's wrong with me? Like, why am I sort of not moving forward with my career? I just keep jumping from thing to thing. And that still affects me, obviously, in my adult life. And the other one has been around my emotional dysregulation. Like, even after going to therapy and really working on that, still having a hard time with emotional regulation, which I thought was primarily ADHD, but there were also some other things that came up in this appointment around that too. Expectations going in, I was kind of like glad that the psychiatrist that I spoke to was someone that was recommended to me and that was specifically ADHD informed, like an ADHD psychiatrist working in a clinic that only deals with ADHD and autism and neurodivergence, but that sort of being the specialty area of this psychiatrist. And that someone else had seen her and someone else had told me she was great. That made me have expectations that I could be quite open with a psychiatrist and not try to mask too much, which I do tend to do when I go into doctor's appointments. In terms of the feelings I had beforehand, I felt really anxious, actually. I don't know why, but I did. I found, especially the last few hours leading up to this appointment, I actually ended up just going to the gym because I could feel like I just had a lot of adrenaline in my system and I just felt really, like I don't know what the anxiety was about. Maybe it was anticipation. I felt like I was waiting around for a long time. Whenever there's something booked in at the end of the day, I always find that really hard because I spend the whole day thinking about that thing that's booked in the afternoon. When I was actually in the appointment, I felt fine. Like the psychiatrist put me at ease immediately, which was really nice. So the conversation started with a little bit about like why I wanted to see the psychiatrist and her kind of explaining to me that, don't worry so much about the diagnosis. Let's focus more on like what's going on in your life and how, where you're wanting to go, what you're wanting to get to. So in terms of the questions I was then asked, it was kind of almost like similar to probably when you go to your first therapy appointment or you go to your first psychology appointment in terms of just understanding a little bit about my background. So understanding a little bit about like childhood traumas, understanding a little bit about behaviors when I was a kid. But then it kind of led into some interesting questions that I didn't expect as much as well, which was around my family and history of things like psychosis, schizophrenia, bipolar, and like suicide, those types of things. So the mental health history of my family and my mental health history as well. I guess I did partly expect it, but some of the like nitty gritty details I didn't. So like, is bipolar in your family? And that led to a discussion about me, my experiences with mania, and kind of getting like a bipolar diagnosis as well. So the psychiatrist essentially said, because the manic episode or hypomanic episode I had was so long ago, and it was related to other things going on in my life, that it could be considered like a low-grade psychosis or bipolar type 2, which is like the lighter version of bipolar. But that also plays a role in then like what meds I might be able to take in terms of ADHD. So that was interesting. Also, some of the things that seem to be causing me the most amount of difficulty seems to come more from like trauma than it does from ADHD. And what I found really interesting was that the psychiatrist said that in some ways ADHD might have actually been helpful. So, yeah, I mean, I probably should explain. I did get diagnosed with ADHD, but I didn't hear about that till like towards the end of the appointment. So like we had a long discussion about how I manage things, how I, finances, what my, what I'm like with administration tasks or housekeeping tasks, things like that. And also what I'm like at work, what my, bosses say about me, what my experiences in my career have been, and things like that. So we talked about all of those things, and I know I'm jumping around a little bit, but essentially I did end up with the ADHD diagnosis. So towards the end of the session, maybe 20 minutes before we finished up, the psychiatrist said to me, "So do you have ADHD?" "Yes. However, some of the things that are affecting you, like in terms of what I was talking about in relation to conflict and finding conflict hard, is actually probably more to do with like childhood trauma. Even though I've seen a therapist, there's still like that can be impacting things." So I thought that was really interesting. And I also thought that was really cool that the psychiatrist very much took the approach of, look, like ADHD isn't a bad thing. It's just that it means that in terms of how our world currently operates, it's like your brain works a little bit differently. So if it was like the example she gave us, she's like, if you were a knight 300 years ago fighting in a battle, like your brain would really suit that, and I thought that was really interesting. And sort of that idea of being a bit more of a warrior like that, which I also like, not warrior with an O, warrior with an A. But she also mentioned being a peacekeeper as well, which is also something that other people have said to me, like, you've been a peacekeeper. So that made me think that there's a lot more to talk about here, but I won't go into that right now. I want to walk you through a little bit more about the actual appointment and what that was like. So sorry, I keep looking down. It's because I'm looking at my notes to try to keep this somewhat linear, because there's a lot that I'm trying to kind of get around. But I wanted to do this while I feel like this, because I know that there's people that are probably coming out of appointments or coming out of a similar experience, and maybe it's good to know that there's other people who kind of experience maybe similar things. So in terms of the questions asked, one of the other things I found interesting was I did definitely get validation, and that was great because I wanted that, I expected that, and I got it, so I was happy. I felt relieved because I was like, okay, all right, like I am not imagining things. I kept second guessing myself and going, maybe I don't have ADHD, maybe I don't have the right to call myself an ADHDer, and I think that it didn't really leave any doubt in my mind in terms of that. There's one follow-up thing I need to do, which is I need to send the psychiatrist my report cards. And it's interesting because I said to her, like, look, my report cards are all pretty good. Like, I got a lot of good marks. I got a lot of good feedback from my teachers. If anything, the only thing they would sometimes complain about was that I talk too much. And they'd also maybe say something like, it's great, Lauren's really engaged in class. Lauren asks lots of questions, and I would sort of, debate with them and things like that. And the psychiatrist said to me, like, in terms of the class, like, were you the person who was generally the loudest, or were you the person that like drew attention to yourself? And I was like, yeah, in the classroom, I definitely did that. I've always done that, even as an adult learning, like, and I try not to. I'm like, don't say anything, like, it's okay. Just like try to like keep it in, like, don't annoy people. But I also was like a good student. Like, it was seen as like a good thing. I was lucky with my teachers that they saw it as a good thing. But then outside of the classroom, I was actually really quiet. I found social situations quite hard. And that's also apparently quite typical of ADHD. And we were talking about in my teenage years, because when I was a kid, I was actually homeschooled. So I thought that was interesting, because one of the things that I was like, oh, maybe there'll be some hesitation around this, or it depends which psychiatrist and what they think, like, is that I would have been considered a bright student. Like, I did well at school. I didn't necessarily like school. I didn't like how repetitive it was, but I did well at it. And I think there is this sort of like stereotype of someone with ADHD being someone who doesn't perform at school, and that being like the only sort of version of ADHD. But when I had done my own research, what I found was actually that, no, you can be quite bright and have ADHD. So yeah, it kind of confirmed things a little bit more for me when I was able to just tell my story and be like, no, like, my report cards are good. I was a good student. I got lots of awards, and it actually, when I said to her, because at the end of the session, she said to me, do you have any questions for me? And I said, yeah, like, why do you think I have ADHD? And that was one of the reasons, is she was like, well, you did really well at school, and then in your career, it kind of not following through. So it's not like I've been this really high achieving employee in terms of like career progression. Like, I've kind of just had lots of different careers, but I haven't gone to like middle management. I haven't gone to upper management, even though it's like I excelled at school. So you'd expect someone who was excelling academically to then have that follow through, which I didn't have. And also like the longest job I've had is like 2 years full-time work. That's the longest one. So the longest job I actually have had is being self-employed. I ran my own business for 6 years, but in terms of working for other people, they've all been like shorter jobs. Another question, all these questions came from ChatGPT, by the way. Another question was any emotions that came up. I think because I'm very used to talking about my childhood and like stuff that's happened that wasn't the best, it didn't really make me that emotional. I find it quite easy in some ways to detach. And I also thought it was interesting because the psychiatrist also said, she asked me a question of like, do you find that sometimes you just disconnect? And I was like, yeah, definitely. Can just definitely disconnect. And she's like, you don't seem to be someone who holds grudges. And I was like, no, I don't really hold any grudges. I kind of like, as long as I can get the stuff out, then it's sort of like I move on. But if I can't get the stuff out, I don't move on. So emotions wise, yeah, like I felt like maybe a little bit of discomfort when I was talking about some trauma stuff, but it wasn't too full on. And then in terms of shifting how I saw past struggles, I think that's part of the relief. So the question ChatGPT asks is, did diagnosis shift how I saw past struggles? Or how you saw past struggles? I think I already had gone through that a little bit with the self-diagnosis piece. Like when I started thinking, I think my brain and my nervous system works a bit different to a lot of people, then it also made me start thinking, okay, so this is also why I've struggled with certain things, like that career question, like the not being able to hold things in. So I thought it was really interesting. One of the things that I was talking about when it comes to work is that I can kind of be like, that's unfair, and then I say something. I don't have a problem with speaking up. And that the psychiatrist said can be a combination of like trauma and ADHD. So it's like my particular way of being raised, and the things that bugged me was like unfairness. So that instead of it being like, I've always thought unfairness was more like ADHD link, but she was saying for me anyway, it was more linked to the trauma part. And then it's like the ADHD part is like, oh wait, I lost what I was going to say. Oh yeah, okay. So with my boss, or bosses that I've had, they can kind of get frustrated with me, or other people can get like a bit like taken aback by sometimes when I say things. So the part where I say the things, that's the impulsivity part. So she's like, the ADHD, the impulsivity part is actually what's making you say it and finding it hard to keep it in. But the part that's actually finding it unfair is the trauma part. And she was saying that lots of people will see that things are unfair, but then politics, ego, other things come into play. And so then they can like keep that in, where I will tend to say them. And also in social settings, sometimes I say things that other people are like, why did you say that? That was a dumb thing to say. It doesn't happen all the time, but it definitely happens at times. That's more of an impulsivity thing. That's more an ADHD thing. I think the other thing is like, I did feel really like proud of myself in some ways. Like the psychiatrist was kind of like, you've actually found like really good tools for doing certain things and managing certain things and kind of being able to get through the day and get through life and stuff. And I think that's really true of a lot of ADHDers. And I think it's also what comes so much into like my own coaching. Like I work full time as a coach now, and a lot of the people that I coach are their students, and they're neurodivergent. And so it's like I can use the experiences that I've had to then help them as well. But I know also that it's not so much about someone telling you what to do. It's more about someone hearing what's going on and helping you come to your own conclusion, which is how I learn as well. So yeah, that was really good. And then in terms of moving forward, so one of the things the psychiatrist asked me was like, you know, what are your goals and aspirations? And I just kind of skipped over that question and said, I find that type of question really hard to answer. I said, I guess it's just like maybe not feeling like so much like I'm walking on a tightrope at times. I feel like, if I just don't exercise, like, boom, if I don't do this, it's like, you know, if I don't take care of my nutrition, if I drink too much, if like things get too stressful, like I have to keep everything so balanced to feel like I can function. And if I waver off that, things get tricky pretty quickly. So I said it'd be nice to have a bit of a wider tightrope to walk on. You know, it'd be nice to have a little bit more width in that. And we did talk about meds. However, because of the thing I said before about the potential bipolar or, you know, low grade psychosis issue, the problem is that if I take a stimulant, that could be problematic for me and send me into like a hypomanic state, which I would really not like. So we talked about if I went down that path, taking like a very low amount of a mood stabilizer. But the psychiatrist said, like, have a think about it. Like, you know, you've got a lot of tools that are helping you through your day to day. So it's like up to you. I'm not kind of like you need to go on meds or you must not take them. It's sort of something to work on. So I thought that was interesting. I think where I'm at the moment is I just really wanted the validation part, because I find like between like having caffeine and having, you know, sort of balancing my nutrition, taking care of my nutrition through supplementation as well, things can be pretty okay. But I almost like wanted to, like the last few months I've wanted to see what happens if I like dial that back, or what happens if I don't stay so on top of things, so I could understand that this is a consistent thing throughout my life, instead of feeling like unsure, like where I'm like, oh, things are pretty good today, maybe I don't have ADHD. You know, I was trying to actually experience what my life is like if I'm not so strict with things. So I think I'm going to, you know, sort of implement that a little bit more. For those of you who don't know, I'm studying a nutrition course at the moment, which I'm nearly finished as well. Obviously, I left it to the last minute to do most of it, but I'm doing that at the moment. So I'm going to be a qualified nutritionist as well. Like I've done my personal training and I've done my science degree, but having that nutrition on top of it, I think will be really helpful, not just for me, but then for my clients as well. And so I think I can sort of use that. And then I've done the therapy before, and I feel like I've got a lot of tools from that. So I think for me, it was almost like I've done this the other way around, where I'm kind of like, oh, I've done so much to make my life feel pretty manageable and pretty good and pretty positive, and I can see that I have some great strengths. And now I've got that second piece, which is like, oh, I don't have to be so hard on myself anymore about those things that I find hard, those things that I find difficult. One more thing that we did talk about that I don't think I mentioned was OCD. So I explained to the psychiatrist a bit about OCD symptoms I experienced as a teenager, and then she asked me a little bit about my childhood, and I explained that I had OCD symptoms in childhood as well, because I had been told like one time that, if you get bacteria on your hands or germs on your hands, you shouldn't put your hands in your mouth. And so then I just constantly washed my hands all the time. I did that for a long time. And so, yeah, it seems like, I think my understanding anyway from our discussion was, it's like, yeah, I have OCD, but I don't have it at the moment. It's sort of like I don't meet the criteria for OCD anymore, but like I did have OCD, or at least OCD symptoms. But I don't know how relevant that is to my life right now, because everything kind of seems pretty good in terms of that. The last question that ChatGPT suggested that I answer is, what would I say to someone else going through this process? So if you haven't yet booked your appointment, I would say make sure you see a psychiatrist who is really ADHD informed. And also, if you're assigned female at birth, identify as a woman, or have been conditioned as a woman, like even if you're like me and you're non-binary, you're still like conditioned as a woman growing up, let's say, it can be really useful to see a psychiatrist who is either female or who is experienced in female ADHD, because, and I say female as in like 2X female, double X chromosomes, because that ADHD can look quite different in that case. And if you know someone who's told you about a psychiatrist who's great, I think that's really useful too, because I've heard stories about psychiatrists who've been not that awesome with this stuff. So I think that's what I would say if you haven't booked an appointment yet. In terms of, and I know they can be hard to get, and I know they're expensive as well. So I'm not even saying everyone should go see a psychiatrist. I just mean if you're on that path. And I think the other thing I'd say is that the validation can be really worth it. Like obviously, again, it's expensive to go through this process, but it's a formal process. Like I said, like I have to now send some report cards and things. It's like you've actually got documentation of the fact that you have ADHD, and there's things that then go with that. Like there's even grants and things like that. Or, if you're looking for reasonable adjustments at work, like you've actually got paperwork to say, hey, like this is what's going on for this person, which can be really useful. And yeah, like the last thing is with the self-diagnosis piece, I think it's also really valid. I really do. Like I see people talking about like, oh, self-diagnosis, you can't say you have ADHD till you get a diagnosis, and, you have to go through this process. But I really think self-diagnosis is a very valid thing. I think that there's a reason that we get interested in this stuff. And if you're kind of like, it's not so much about meds, it's not so much about other maybe comorbidities, but it's more about self-insight, then I think it's very valid. And that's why I think we have that sort of idea of neurodivergence as an alternative way of identifying ourselves, right? It's like my brain works differently, my nervous system works differently, and so I do things a bit differently. And I would say probably the other thing is maybe I should have had a better idea of my goals. Like this psychiatrist was really awesome about it and kind of laughed and understood. Yeah, I think goals can be really hard for us as ADHDers, but I think it can be useful to have it. I wish I maybe had a bit more of a think about like what I wanted in terms of that, but it turned out fine for me. I don't think it was a problem, but just depending on the psychiatrist, maybe it could be useful as well. But yeah, I think talking to someone who sees people with ADHD, every day of the week, and them turning around and saying, do you have ADHD? Yes, was sort of like boom for me. Is like, cool. Like, I feel like I have some closure around this now. I feel like I have sort of like less second guessing myself now, which is awesome. So yeah, that's what happened. Let me know if you have any questions, and I hope this was useful, and I hope this will help you live a little bit more of a balanced-ish life and feel a bit more validated if you are kind of just thinking self-diagnosis is the right thing for you. And yeah, I'll talk to you soon.